1854. Manchester, New Hampshire. Inside mill number 2 of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. The air carries the metallic warmth of a cast iron column, thick as a man's torso, and the floor timbers carry a vibration that travels up through the soles of work boots into the hollow of the chest. The flywheel is already turning. It has been turning since before sunrise. On the weave floor above, the men feel it the way a sailor feels, a calm sea through the small bones of the feet, through the rattle of bobbins on shelves, through the trembling water in their tin cups. 56 tons of cast iron, a rim measured in feet, not inches, rotating at a speed the engineers have set and the governor has held for 10,000 mornings. The wheel does what it has done 10,000 mornings. That is the point. In the engine room below, a fireman opens the boiler door and shovels in a measured load of anthracite. He turns his back to close the door. The flywheel splits. One arm tears free at the hub. A single iron fragment travels upward through 3 floors of pine, timber, and brick. Looms are sheared from their mounts. A man on the 3rd floor is gone before the sound reaches him. Debris lands in the canal, in the street, on the roof of a building 200 yards away. It was not built to kill. It was built to regulate, to smooth the pulse of steam into the steady heartbeat of 1,000 looms. So why did the most disciplined machine in the mill become the one that turned the mill floor into a kill zone? To understand how this ended in cast iron shrapnel, you have to go back to the design era, to the foundries and drafting rooms of early industrial New England, where the wheel was not yet a weapon, but an answer. In the 1820s and 1830s, along the Merrimack River corridor that linked Lowell to the rising mills of Manchester, the men who designed textile factories were drowning in a problem that ledgers could measure, but pistons could not yet solve. Beam engines and early low-pressure steam systems, brought in to supplement water wheels during dry months, delivered power in jolts. Torque arrived unevenly. Gear trains shattered. Thread broke faster than weavers could retie it. Amoskeag's millwrights, among them a young engineer who would later rise to plant agent, Ezekiel A. Straw, read the corporate ledgers and saw what every irregular pulse cost in dollars and bobbins. They needed a mechanical solution that could swallow inconsistency and exhale uniformity. They needed mass in motion. The math was old. A rotating disc, given enough mass and enough velocity, stores energy as inertia. Release that energy slowly and steadily, and 100 connected machines run as if they shared a single pulse. The principle was understood in clockwork, in water wheels, in the small flywheels of stationary engines. What was new was scale. The mill engineers proposed to take the principle and multiply it by a factor that would have astonished the clockmakers of a generation earlier. They were not building a weapon. They were building silence, the absence of jolt. The decision came in the 1840s, in the foundry yards and machine shops where cast iron was treated as the most rational material on earth. It was cheap. It was dense. It could be poured into hub and arm and rim segment, bolted together, machine true, balanced, and trusted. The engineers calculated rim speed against the tensile limits they understood from the metallurgy of their day. And they sized the wheel to maximize stored kinetic energy without, in their math, exceeding what the iron could bear. Foundry ledgers recorded the tonnage of metal poured. Specification drawings recorded the geometry of the rim segments and the bolt patterns that held them. Machine shop blueprints recorded the keyways cut into the hub. Every calculation was conservative by the standards of the day. Every margin was generous. Every assumption was that cast iron behaved as a uniform, predictable material whose behavior under repeated stress could be inferred from its behavior under single-event load. None of those assumptions was correct, but they were the best assumptions the profession had, and they were applied with discipline. A bigger wheel meant smoother power. Smoother power meant more looms per shaft. More looms per shaft meant more cloth, more profit, more reason to build the next wheel even larger. And here, the first irony took shape. The flywheel was, by every measure available to its designers, the safest and most disciplined component in the building. It did not explode like a boiler. It did not arc like a belt. It simply turned. Yet because it worked so well, It concentrated more stored energy than any other system in the plant. They believed they had built the most disciplined machine in the mill. They had built the largest unexploded ordnance in New Hampshire. The first installation followed the engineering logic with the patience of civil works. A pit was excavated below floor level, lined with brick to contain the wheel's lower arc. Shaft bearings were set on cut stone foundations. The governor linkage tied steam throttle to wheel speed in a feedback loop that reads, "In the surviving construction invoices and insurance valuations, like an act of mechanical faith." The plant agent signed the orders. The installation foreman supervised the first careful rotations. Local newspapers, which devoted columns to mill expansion the way later papers would devote them to railroads, recorded the wheel's arrival as evidence of progress. The first test rotations were slow. The bearings were watched. The governor was checked. The shaft alignment was measured and remeasured. When the wheel finally came up to operating speed, the engineers stood at a careful distance and listened. They heard nothing alarming. They heard a hum. Within weeks, the hum was no longer remarkable. Within months, it was furniture. For 10 years, the wheel did exactly what it was promised to do. That was the danger. Through the 1840s and into the early 1850s, the scale obsession spread along the Merrimack like a contagion of ambition. Lowell Mills installed their own central wheels. Amoskeag's treasurer pushed for greater output per shaft. Competing owners' names recorded in trade publications and annual reports drove specifications upward in a quiet arms race measured in tons of rim. Wheels that had once weighed 20 tons grew to 40, 40 grew to 56. Operating speeds crept higher as engineers chased the marginal gain of one more loom per line shaft. Each escalation was justified by the same arithmetic that had justified the first wheel. Each escalation moved the rim's outer edge closer to the brittle limit of cast iron, a limit the engineers of the day could approximate, but not measure with the precision the material demanded. The arithmetic worked on paper. It worked on the floor. It worked year after year in the steady output of woven cloth that filled the rail cars heading south to Boston. Every ton added to the rim added a mile to the radius of catastrophe. By the early 1850s, Mill Number 2 had become an organism, and the flywheel was its heart. The belting tree rose from the main shaft to line shafts on every floor, from line shafts to pulleys, from pulleys to the looms that filled the weave floors with their disciplined clatter. Floor walkers learned to hear individual looms inside the collective roar. Weavers timed their footfalls to the rhythm of the shafts. The fireman in the engine room, the engineer at the throttle, the oiler making his rounds with a long-spouted can, each performed his duty inside a body whose pulse was set by the wheel below. The shift bells rang. The lubrication rituals followed their hourly schedule. The quality control walk-around moved from loom to loom in the order it had always followed. Inquest testimony years later would name some of these men. A floor walker who stepped away from his post seconds before the rupture. A weaver who survived because she bent to retrieve a dropped shuttle. A fireman whose back was turned at the boiler door. The men did not run the machine ran the men. And because it ran them so well, no one inspected it the way they inspected the boilers. Boilers had killed people. Boilers had ruptured in Lowell, in Pittsburgh, on Mississippi steamboats, in numbers grim enough that insurance underwriters and state inspectors had begun, slowly, to demand standards. The flywheel had not. New Hampshire in the early 1850s had no formal flywheel inspection regime. There was no protocol for non-destructive testing of cast iron. There was no method, available to mill engineers of the period, for detecting hairline fatigue cracks invisible to the eye. Insurance ledgers recorded wheel installations as capital assets, not as risks. Boiler inspectors entered the engine room, glanced at the wheel as a fixed feature of the architecture, and walked past it. The doctrine that governed inspection was operational history. It has always worked. It has always worked. It has always worked. The doctrine had a logic. Most mechanical systems that fail tend to fail early, in the first weeks or months of operation, when manufacturing flaws reveal themselves under load. A wheel that had run for years without incident was, by the reasoning of the day, a wheel that had proven itself. The reasoning was not crazy. It was simply incomplete. It did not account for the slow accumulation of microscopic fatigue, cycle by cycle, across millions of rotations, in a material that was strong in compression and treacherous in tension. The evidence that this doctrine was wrong existed already. In print, abroad, British textile mills had recorded flywheel bursts in the 1840s. Engineering journals on both sides of the Atlantic had described rim separations, governor failures, overspeed events that ended in fragments through factory walls. Trade publications carried the accounts. But there was no centralized failure registry, no body that aggregated mill disasters into a pattern any single owner could see. The Amoskeag agents, the treasurers, the consulting engineers, each read their own ledgers and their own local press. They did not read the foreign accounts as warnings about their own pit. The evidence was not hidden. It was simply uncollected. By the close of 1853, the conditions for catastrophe had assembled themselves with the patience of accumulating stress. And here, the second irony entered the frame. The very qualities the designers had prized, mass, density, rotational inertia, the wheel's capacity to store enormous kinetic energy and release it as smooth, uniform power, were the qualities that determine the geometry of destruction. Stored kinetic energy is conserved. When a rotating mass fractures, the energy that smoothed 1,000 looms does not vanish. It travels outward, radially, in the direction the rim was already going, at the velocity the rim already carried. Rim velocity becomes fragment velocity. Rim mass becomes fragment mass. The wheel's design strength and the wheel's destructive potential were the same number, written twice. The engineers had not been wrong about the energy. They had only been wrong about who would receive it. Every quality the engineers prized became, in the instant of failure, the measurement of the harm. The rupture, when it came in February 1854, did not announce itself. A microscopic fatigue crack accumulated invisibly across years of stress cycles in a hub or arm-to-rim junction reached its limit on an ordinary morning. There was no warning thrum. There was no alarm in the governor's tick. The wheel simply ceased to be a wheel and became its constituent fragments, traveling at rim speed in directions determined by the geometry of fracture. Coroner's records, inquest transcripts, and the columns of the Manchester papers reconstructed the seconds afterward in physical inventory. Looms torn from mounts, pine flooring punched through. Brick masonry of the pit cracked outward. Men killed where they stood. Debris recovered from the canal, from the street, from the roof of a building, reports placed at 200 yards. Witnesses described a sound that was not a single sound, but a sequence, a sharp crack, a sustained tearing, a low concussion that rolled outward through the brick walls of the mill. Some accounts placed the loudest fragment's impact in the canal, where the iron struck water and threw a column of spray. Other accounts placed it in the street, where horses bolted and a teamster was thrown from his seat. The wheel did not fail loudly. It failed completely. In the days that followed, Manchester behaved the way 19th century mill towns behaved when their central machines killed their citizens. There were funerals. There were sermons. Editorials called for caution without being able to specify what caution meant in the absence of an inspection regime. Selectmen visited the site. Clergymen visited the families. Amoskeag's corporate minutes, preserved in the company archives, recorded the practical decisions: damage assessed, replacement wheel ordered, mill restarted on a schedule measured in days, not weeks. The looms could not stand idle. The contracts had to be filled. The shafts had to turn. The replacement wheel was, by every account, of essentially the same design as the wheel that had failed, the same material, the same general geometry, the same governing assumptions. The economics demanded continuity. The engineering profession had not yet produced an alternative the mill could buy. They buried the dead on Sunday. The shafts turned again on Monday. The inquest convened with the procedural seriousness the disaster demanded. Investigators measured the debris with extraordinary precision. They weighed the largest recovered fragments. They mapped trajectories from the pit outward through the floors. They traced the fracture back, where they could, to its likely point of origin in the casting. The coroner's verdict named the mechanical event. The testifying engineer described the failure mode. And here the third irony closed the circle. Forensic precision on the wreckage produced no reform of the design philosophy that had produced the wreckage. There was no ban on cast iron flywheels. There was no state inspection regime created in response. There was no requirement that mills maintain stress cycle records or commission metallurgical examinations of their wheels. The investigation documented what had broken. It did not ask whether the system that produced unbreakable confidence in cast iron mass was itself the failure. The institutional reflex was to treat the disaster as an isolated mechanical event, a single bad casting, a single unfortunate morning, rather than as the predictable consequence of a design philosophy applied at industrial scale across a generation of mills. They measured the debris with extraordinary care. They did not measure the system that produced it. Reform, when it came slowly and from an unexpected quarter. Through the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, flywheel failures continued across American industry, in textile mills, in paper mills, in the rolling mills of the iron and steel trade. Each new failure was reported locally. Each new inquest reached conclusions similar to those reached in Manchester. The pattern was visible only to those who looked across many failures, in many states, over many years. The Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company, founded in 1866, began aggregating the failure data that no government body had compiled. Insurance bulletins circulated. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers, organized in 1880, gave the profession a forum in which flywheel failures could be analyzed across companies and across states. Designs shifted. Steel-rimmed wheels replaced cast iron rims. Segmented flywheels with steel banding contained the consequences of fracture. Patent records trace the slow migration of the profession away from the material that had defined a generation of mill engineering. Premiums on cast iron flywheel installations climbed. Coverage narrowed. Eventually, the math that had once justified the wheel ran in reverse. The cost of insuring it exceeded the savings of running it. Reform did not arrive on the wings of conscience. It arrived on the ledger of the underwriter. And then, finally, the economics that had built the wheel killed the wheel. Direct drive electric motors, distributed across the factory floor, eliminated the need for a central source of stored kinetic energy. Each loom, each line shaft, each machine could be powered locally. The flywheel pit became unnecessary. The governor linkage became obsolete. The belting tree, which had defined the architecture of the mill for 3 generations, was cut down branch by branch as motors arrived on the floor. Amoskeag, which had once defined American textile manufacturing, converted its drives in the early decades of the 20th century, then declined through the 1920s as Southern mills underbid New England on labor, then filed for dissolution in 1935 and closed in 1936. The pits were filled, the shafts were removed. The governors were scrapped. The hum that had once defined the buildings was replaced first by the higher whine of induction motors, then, after the dissolution, by nothing at all. Demolition photographs preserved in the Manchester Historic Association show the floors where the wheels once turned, the timbers still grooved by decades of vibration, the brick of the pit walls exposed to daylight for the first time since installation. A salvage foreman working through the carcass of the plant in the late 1930s recorded the dimensions of what was hauled away. The last cast iron flywheel of the type that had killed in 1854 went out as scrap. The floor that once trembled stands still. The machine that never failed again because it no longer exists has finally kept the promise it was built to make.